Professor Tuddenham, I'm going to ask you to look with me at some documents which show the response of UK HCDO to the AIDS crisis 1983-1984. We won't look at absolutely everything, but just to put it in its chronological context, the first reference to AIDS in a reference centre directors meeting was September 1982, and the request was made at that point to Dr. Crask to look into the matter and report back to the AGM that was taking place a week later. So I'm not going to show you those, but I'm going to pick matters up then in 1983. Could we have HCDO 40411, please, Henry? So if we go to the next page, we can see it's the minutes of the Reference Centre Directors meeting held at the Royal Free on the 14th of February 1983, and we can see that you and Dr. Kernoff are both in attendance. And then, Henry, if we could go to page 4, please. Sorry, next page, my apologies. You'll see there, Professor Tuddenham, under the paragraph headed The AIDS Syndrome, Professor Bloom referred to the Stockholm meeting. There's an update that the reports from the US suggest that the incidence of AIDS was higher than at first thought. There's an expression of concern that the haemophiliac population of the UK who'd received American concentrates might be at risk. Dr. Crask then summarised latest information, approximately 10 cases thought to have occurred in non-haemophiliacs now in the UK. And then there's a reference...
I think it may be 12, might it? 10 in London.
Oh, yes, I'm sorry, sir, you're absolutely right. Yes, 10 cases thought to have occurred in London, 1 in Glasgow, 1... It may be that's right. And then, in any event, those are non-haemophiliac cases. And then we see Dr. Crask had drawn up a draft form. There's a lengthy discussion about it. And the agreement is that Dr. Crask will draw up a new form for the reporting of cases and arrange for it to be circulated to Haemophilia Centre directors. And then there's a suggestion of inviting an immunologist to join the hepatitis working party. So is it, first of all, do you have any recollection of that particular meeting and the discussions about AIDS in February 1983?
Yes, of course. We were on full alert, anxious, worried, and like everyone else, still highly puzzled as to what could be causing this syndrome, presumed by now to be transmissible by direct contact means and therefore likely to be a virus, and looking for advice on how to move forward, given that it was clear by then that the haemophilia population was at risk.
And the action that was agreed at this stage didn't involve any recommendations about any change of approach to treatment. It's a plan to prepare a form so that cases could be reported to the reference centre directors.
Yes, just observation.
And then we can see what Dr. Crask drew up and what was sent out. If we look at RFLT 000021, this is the copy that came to Dr. Kernoff, but we have, there were copies that went to, we assume, all Haemophilia Centre directors. So it's dated the 22nd of March 1983, and you'll see it refers in the second line to the recent meeting of the reference centre directors, have prompted us to circulate the enclosed papers so that a system for the reporting of possible cases of AIDS can be quickly set up. And then if we go to, in fairness, if I go to the third paragraph, we can see that Dr. Crask, Dr. Ritzer and Professor Bloom say we strongly urge you, i.e. directors, to collaborate in reporting cases of this symptom, of this syndrome. There were two documents enclosed with this. We'll just look briefly at one of them. Professor Tuddenham, HCDO 4 zeros, 517_002, I think. So this is one of the documents that was sent out to all directors, and presumably you would have seen it.
Yes.
It's headed aids. It's authored by Dr. Krask. This one's dated the 1st of March 1983. There are earlier iterations of it that were shared with reference centre directors in the autumn of 82. But we can see, if we look towards the bottom of this page, here we see the first of two features noted. Here, in the last paragraph, the delay between the occurrence of initial symptoms and diagnosis, and an observation that the signs and symptoms were mostly insidious and non-specific. And then we go over the page. We can see underneath the list of symptoms, there's a paragraph that begins, the overall mortality was highest in those of patients with PCP. And you'll see there the mortality rates, which are obviously very high. If we go on to page 3, we can see then, under the heading etiology towards the bottom of the page, Dr. Krask advances 3 theories. The first is about the possibility of the effect of drugs. Would you agree with me? He's then discounting that. He says this is not a factor as the disease has been described in patients who don't use this drug. And then he talks about the immunosuppressive effect of cytomegalovirus infection and says this seems unlikely. So those two theories are put forward but effectively put to one side. Would you accept that? So for the transcript, Professor Tuddenham, if you wouldn't mind saying yes or no rather than nodding.
Yes.
Thank you. And then over onto the next page, he says here then his third cause is the suggestion of an infectious agent with a similar epidemiology to that of hepatitis B. And then he goes on to say if 3 is the most likely cause, it's possible such an agent might be present in the plasma pools used to prepare commercial factor VIII and IX concentrate, manufactured from donor plasma collected in the USA. He then goes on to discuss the 3 cases where the likeliest mode of transmission has been blood or platelet transfusion. And explains at least 10 haemophiliacs, this is in the States, have been reported with clinical features of the syndrome. 5 have died. And then if we go to the next page, second paragraph, he says it's thought likely that batches of factor VIII concentrate which might contain the AIDS agent came into use since January the 1st, 1980 in the USA. Now, I've obviously not gone through the entirety of the paper with you, Professor Tuddenham, but would you agree that what emerges from that is, although there is still much that is not yet known, it's likely that the route of transmission for haemophiliacs is blood products?
Yes.
And this is a disease understood to have a high mortality rate?
Yes.
So that's March 1983. We then come on in terms of the next step taken by UK HCDO, or by the reference centre directors, to a meeting on the 13th of May of 1983. Now, this is one of the few meetings he didn't attend, but for the sake of completeness, we'll look at it. It's HCDO 603_008, I think, Henry. So we can see this is a meeting at St Thomas's the 13th of May 1983. You're not there for this meeting, Dr. Kernoff is, and it's a special meeting that's been called. If we go to the second page, we can see a discussion in the last paragraph as follows. With regard to general policy to be followed in the use of factor VIII concentrates, it was noted that many directors have up until now reserved a supply of NHS concentrates for children and mildly affected haemophiliacs, and it was considered that it would be circumspect to continue with that policy. It was also agreed that there was as yet insufficient evidence to warrant restriction of the use of imported concentrates in other patients in view of the immense benefits of therapy. The situation should be kept under constant review. So this would appear to be the first discussion of whether anything should be done in terms of changing the approach to treatment. But would you agree there is no specific recommendation of any change of approach? It's just circumspect to continue with an existing policy if that is your existing policy. Is that a fair characterisation?
Yes.
And then we'll see the document that was then sent out in light of that meeting. HCDO 40/270_004, please, Henry. So this is the letter of the 24th of June 1983. This is a blank version, but we understand again it was sent out to Haemophilia Centre directors. It refers to the special meeting that we've just looked at and says this, so far one possible case has been reported to our organisation. This patient conforms to the definition published by the CDC in Atlanta but cannot be considered as a definite case. We're not aware of any other definable patients amongst the UK haemophiliac population. Pausing there for a moment, Professor Tuddenham, we understand that to be a reference to a case in Cardiff of a patient who was under Professor Bloom's care. Do you recall, and I know in particular Professor Bloom had been you describe him I think as something of a mentor to you, did you ever discuss that case, that first AIDS case in a haemophiliac with him at the time?
No, I wasn't in frequent contact with Arthur then, other than at the reference centre directors' meetings.
Okay.
The first confirmed case was in Bristol.
That was the first death, we think.
First death, yeah. If Arthur had a case he suspected in Cardiff, I wasn't aware of it.
Okay.
Well, can I just clarify about the information we have about the Bristol case? Is that it hadn't been reported to the UK HCDO, and that was the subject of some concern later at a meeting in the autumn. Because it had happened, it hadn't been reported, so somehow the reporting systems missed it.
Yes, that's right, yes.
That now rings a bell, I can see.
It does, yes, yes. It came out of the blue. It was a bit of a shock. The then director of the Bristol Centre wasn't kind of prominent at national meetings.
Was that Dr. Daly?
Yes.
Yes. And then we can see that the two recommendations that are here given are one, for mildly affected patients with haemophilia A or von Willebrand's and minor lesions, treatment with DDAVP should be considered because of the increased risk of transmitting hepatitis by means of large pool concentrates in such patients. This is in any case the usual practice of many directors. And then two, for treatment of children and mildly affected patients or patients unexposed to imported concentrates, many directors already reserve supplies of NHS concentrates, cryoprecipitate or freeze-dried, and it would be circumspect to continue this policy. So, again, what this would appear to be is a recommendation for directors to continue with existing policies if they have them in relation to children and mildly affected patients or previously untreated patients, and a recommendation to consider the use of DDAVP from the categories of patients there identified. It's quite tentative, isn't it? It falls short of any kind of firm steer or recommendation.
Yes, it's just a polite suggestion with evidence and reasons given, but it's by no means an order. And as I mentioned earlier, we the UKHCDO, weren't actually in a position to issue orders, just recommendations.
Yes, no, I except not in a position to issue orders. there could be this kind of polite suggestion, as you characterised it, at one end of a spectrum, an instruction at the other, and in between there could be much firmer advice or recommendations than this. Would you accept that?
I accept that. There can be firmer, or there can be... Clinical advice is usually couched in very polite terms.
Yes. And we'll see later, when we finally get to December 1984, that there were recommendations that were put in different terms. So this was June 1983, arising out of the 13th of May 1983 meeting. I just want to show you a document from around this time, which is CBLA 5043_040. This is a letter dated the 9th of May 1983, and it's written by Dr. Spence Galbraith, who was at the Communicable Disease Surveillance Centre in London. He's addressing it to the Department of Health. You'll see in the first paragraph he talks about the case in Cardiff. He actually identifies it as being a Cardiff case and explains that it fits the recognised criteria for the diagnosis of AIDS, and then refers to some other reports in the Lancet and of other cases. And then we can see his recommendation in the second paragraph is, I've reviewed the literature and come to the conclusion that all blood products made from blood donated in the USA after 1978 should be withdrawn from use until the risk of AIDS transmission by these products has been clarified. So Dr. Spence Galbraith, with presumably the same or similar information available to him as would have been available to the reference centre directors, came up with a very different recommendation. Do you recall whether this came to the attention of the reference centre directors at this time?
I don't recall it. Until you brought it to my attention, I've never seen this letter or aware of this view having been promoted. Did you say it was Kenneth Galbraith?
Dr. Spence Galbraith.
Spence Galbraith.
Who was, public health was his area of speciality. He was based at the Communicable Disease Surveillance Centre, so the cases were supposed to be reported to him.
In the UK? In the UK. Wow, well, it's quite an authoritative opinion.
And I don't say this as certainly as a criticism of you, Professor Tuddenham, or necessarily of any of the reference centre directors, but this is the kind of opinion that should have been shared, should it not, with the reference centre directors? By somebody.
Somebody, he himself might have considered doing that, but I don't have any recall of it being proposed as a radical proposal. But it didn't make its way onto my desk.
No. If we go to the next page, he sets out a number of reasons, and I just wanted to go through the reasons with you. So the reasons for his recommendations: one, the AIDS epidemic in the USA is probably due to a transmissible agent. Would you agree with that?
Yes.
Based upon the knowledge at the time.
Yes.
Two, the agent is probably transmitted by blood and blood products. Would you agree?
Yes. Three,
and this may be where his public health hat was significant, he said this: although this number of cases of AIDS associated with the administration of factor VIII concentrate is very small in relation to the number of individuals receiving the product, this may not indicate that the risk is small. And he goes on to explain why that is. Would you accept that as a proposition that could and should have been understood at the time, that the number of currently reported cases was not necessarily the guide to what the true extent of the risk was?
I agree.
And then if we go over the page, please.
Fundamental principle of epidemiology.
And if we go over the page, please, to point 4, factor VIII concentrate and pooled products would appear to have a high risk of being contaminated with AIDS agent, and he explains that's because of the donor pool. Would you agree with that?
There's a slightly surprising suggestion there that homosexuals are more frequent blood donors than others.
I think there may have been some evidence available, it may have been available to Dr. Spence Galbraith, about certain practices and locations in which bloods were collected for donation in the States. So maybe it's a reference to that.
Interesting.
But in terms of the donor pool giving rise to a high risk of contamination, you would accept that as a statement as at 1983?
Yes.
And then 5, apparently no means of ensuring that blood or blood products are free of the AIDS agent. And that was correct at the time?
Of course, yes.
And then point 6 is the high mortality rate, which was also known at the time.
Yes.
So we have the polite suggestion from the reference centre directors and then the rather bolder suggestion here. We then come on, in terms of the next reference centre director consideration, to the 19th of September of this year.
Excuse me.
Yes.
Could I just ask a question
Of course.
again about Dr. Galbraith's letter? Was this published anywhere, or is this an internal communication?
The letter was addressed to an official within the Department of Health.
Right.
So it was not, at least at that stage, published. Whether it was ever published, I'm afraid I don't know the answer.
All right. No. I
Um,
mean, with hindsight, again, cliche comment in the context, but if it had wider exposure, I'm sure it would have had some effect.
and then if we go to HCDO 40413, please, Henry. So we can see this is the next meeting of reference centre directors. It's now the 19th of September 1983, and you and Dr. Kernoff were both in attendance at this meeting. If we go to page 3, we can see current situation regarding AIDS. Dr. Krask presented a paper updating the current situation, and you'll see there reference to the patient who died in Bristol, about 6 lines down, Professor Tuddenham. So I think there is evidence to suggest that death occurred in August of 1983. And then if we look at what was then discussed, we can see a little further down, if we go to the it was agreed, so that Dr. Krask, having given that update, the first thing that was agreed was a point about discouraging manufacturers of concentrates to sell material to non-haemophilia centres. So that may or may not have been an issue of some importance, but would you agree that's not really dealing with the public health issue and the risk of AIDS to haemophiliacs?
No, it isn't. There was some debate still at that time as between treatment or management of haemophiliacs at hospitals or by individual doctors that weren't part of a registered haemophilia centre or reference centre, and that did continue for some time, and I think partly it's referring to that possibility, this kind of unacknowledged, recorded or regulated use of those products.
Yes. And then we can see there's then a discussion about blood products being supplied via regional transfusion centres, and that's the issue that we saw Dr. Kernoff's strong views on this morning. And we can see 4 lines up from the bottom, the reference centre directors expressing grave misgivings about that. Again, that's not really dealing with response to AIDS, is it?
No.
And then if we go to the next page, we can see here, and it touches on some observations you've just made, Professor Tuddenham, about the Galbraith letter. The position regarding the collaboration of the Haemophilia Centre directors, Dr. Krask and the Communicable Disease Surveillance Centre, was raised. Professor Bloom said Dr. Galbraith, director of the CDSC, was somewhat concerned he hadn't heard about the Bristol case until after the patient's death. So you'll see that there were some interactions between Dr. Galbraith and Dr. Krask and possibly Professor Bloom. We don't know the full extent of them. And then the issue that's there discussed, you'll see from that paragraph, is an issue about reporting of cases and whether it should go via Dr. Krask or directly to CDSC. And if we look down the page, we'll see the agreement, the underlined bit. After discussion, it was agreed by a majority that reporting to CDSC should be through Dr. Krask. And then the discussion moves on to the collection of epidemiological data. So would you accept that there are no substantive recommendations here about changes in policy or different ways of treating patients?
Yeah, that is the case.
And then the next meeting is the 17th of October 1983. This is not of reference centre directors alone. This is all directors. It's PRSE 304440, please, Henry. So we can see it's the 17th of October 1983. It's a long list of attendees, and they include you, Professor Tuddenham. And if we go, please, Henry, to page 10, we can see an issue being raised under the heading Any Other Business. And Dr. Chisholm, who was director in Southampton, raised a problem of patients refusing to take up commercial factor VIII. She wondered, in view of the worry of patients, whether directors could revert to using cryoprecipitate for home therapy. Professor Bloom replied he felt there was no need for patients to stop using the commercial concentrates because at present there was no proof that commercial concentrates were the cause of AIDS. Dr. Chisholm pointed out there was a further problem in her region because of problems in getting large amounts of commercial concentrates, whereas she could get unlimited supplies of cryoprecipitate. Other directors reported they had the same problems. After discussion, it was agreed that patients should not be encouraged to go over to cryoprecipitate for home therapy, but should continue to receive the NHS or commercial concentrates in their usual way. Do you have any recollection of that meeting or that debate, Professor Tuddenham?
I don't remember Dr. Chisholm raising this point. It's kind of poignant looking back on it. There was all this cryoprecipitate, and why not use it for home treatment? As we discussed earlier, there was a feeling that was a step, well, there was a reason to say that was a step back, but then as the threat of AIDS from commercial concentrate rises and rises, alternative views are being expressed by the patients as well as the centre directors.
Can I invite you to consider in particular what's recorded here as Professor Bloom's statement? He says there's no need for patients to stop using commercial concentrates because at present there was no proof that the commercial concentrates were the cause of AIDS. Does that surprise you as a statement as at October 1983, that it's being looked at in that way?
Yeah, it depends what your standard of proof is. Where I would say there's very strong circumstantial evidence that they are transmitting AIDS. Very strong indeed.
And then we can see in terms of any action to be taken on the next page, we see current situation regarding AIDS. There's a presentation by Dr. Krask. There's discussion about cases, and there's a suggestion that Dr. Krask will send out details about proposals with regard to recommendations for the handling of samples. So it's very clear that in October 1983, directors are not being given any, or they're not themselves reaching any shared view that there should be any change at all in the course of treatment.
That's correct.
We then move on almost a year before there's another meeting of reference centre directors. So if we could have up on screen, please, Henry, HCDO 40416. So we can see it's now 10th of September 1984. This is a meeting at St Thomas's. You and Dr. Kernoff, amongst others, Dr. Kernoff, amongst others, are present. And if we go to page 8, please, Henry, we can see under the heading Current Situation Regarding AIDS, there's a presentation of more information by Dr. Krask. He presents some graphs, he refers to a paper in the Lancet. He explains that a further 20 patients with AIDS-related symptoms have been notified to him. And then there's a discussion about testing and reference towards the bottom of the page to the possibility of arrangements for HTLV3 testing now being made.
Yes.
Again, I don't know whether you have any recollection of that meeting.
Yes, because by then we'd heard about HTLV3. It was apparent that the most likely causative agent had been identified and we could test for it. So it was time to consider moving forward.
Other than testing, which obviously is a substantive step, there's still, however, no recommendation to directors to do anything different in terms of treatment. Would you accept
No, there
that?
wasn't.
And then we come finally to the meeting at which that was discussed, which is the 10th of December of 1984. So the reference is HCDO 40394_117, please. And we can see this is effectively a special meeting. It's not the normal reference centre directors meeting. You weren't, in fact, in attendance. This is 10th of December 1984. But Dr. Kernoff was, and a number of others as listed there. And if we go, please, Henry, to... it results in recommendations, and I'll show you the recommendations document rather than pore over the minutes, but there are just two parts of the meeting where Dr. Kernoff makes a comment I wanted to ask you about. Page 5, please. You'll see about 4 paragraphs down. This is in the context of a discussion about testing. Dr. Kernoff commented that as some 70% of haemophiliacs are now positive, it may be considered irrelevant if one tells or doesn't tell the results of testing. That seems at first blush a somewhat surprising statement. Is that something that you ever discussed with him?
When I read this, I was very surprised. At the time, I wasn't at the meeting, and so I wasn't aware of it, and I didn't discuss it with him. In the event, as you may be coming to, when we did test all the staff and patients of the Royal Free Haemophilia Centre, we conveyed the results pretty much straight away.
Yes. Well, I will come on to that. We'll just look at the next paragraph, which says the chairman summarised by saying that testing should be instituted as soon as possible and that information on the test result should not be given automatically but if asked for. So it appears to be the view expressed there by Professor Bloom as chair, also that rather than a system of telling patients the results, it will be you'll tell them the results if they ask for them. Would you agree that amongst other things, the patient's got to know they've been tested in order to be able to ask for the result as a matter of logic.
Indeed. There's this range of opinion here, kind of extremes. Everybody gets tested and told the result, over to what we would do now, which is proper counselling before you even take the sample in most cases.
And then if we go to the document that emerged from this meeting, which is HCDO 40270_007, please. So this is the called AIDS advisory document drawn up after that meeting. If we go to the second page, we can see towards the bottom of the page under the heading Options in Probable Decreasing Order of Safety from AIDS for Haemophilia A, there is now a list in order of safety and then a series of recommendations expressed in firmer terms than the earlier material were looked at. So, for example, use DDAVP in mild haemophilia A and von Willebrand's if possible. And then go over to the next page. We can see at the top recommendations for haemophilia A, different categories, and recommendations for haemophilia B. And then if we look at the text just under that, it says, in individual patients, there may need to be a choice. In general, heated concentrate appears to be the recommendation of virologists consulted, but individual directors may wish to make up their own minds. This is particularly true of unheated NHS material. So even at this stage, when there are recommendations, directors are still being told it's a matter for ultimately for their individual judgment.
Yes.
Does that surprise you at that stage, that it's put in those terms?
Not really. There's still some uncertainty as to efficacy of inactivation of the heat treatment. You can see here that it's considered that the heat treatment has inactivated the AIDS agent, HTLV3 as we were calling it then, and but not the NANB agent, which it took quite a while to finally isolate as hepatitis C. So there's a range of risk, and the choice is left to the individual director.
This is, as I say, December 84, so that's roughly 2.5 years after the first reports from the CDC in the States of cases in haemophiliacs. It's 2 years from the report of the San Francisco baby case. It's nearly 2 years from that Immuno London Airport meeting at which the available information was discussed. Looking at that, do you think, Professor Tuddenham, that was a good enough response by the reference centre directors, that it took that long to produce any kind of recommendations to directors?
Seems very gradual and cautious, viewed from here. How good was the evidence for each of the different choices? It's accepted and was correct that UK sourced material is lower risk. It's not no risk. And we have a treatment that may well be effective against HCLV3, and a particular recommendation for patients not previously exposed that they should have the lowest risk material. Although at that point, well, cryo isn't zero risk, it's low risk. Heated NHS factor 8, low risk. There's a dosage phenomenon you have to look at when you're doing an inactivation. How many logs of inactivation versus how many infectious particles are present, and those are variable. So they're pretty, I've got to agree that it's taken a while to get to this point, and still the advice is pretty vague.
I want to then move to deal shortly with some questions relating to what happened thereafter at the Royal Free. We've got some documentary evidence and we've heard from Professor Lee, so I think I can take it very quickly. The evidence we had from Professor Lee suggested that patients were tested at the Royal Free using the stored samples that Dr. Kernoff had started collecting in 1978. And so patients were tested for HTLV3 without knowing they were being tested. Was that something that you knew at the time or was discussed at the time?
It wasn't discussed at the time, and do you know, I don't think I even queried it at the time. We just, yes, we're going to test everyone, and it happened. I didn't take that decision, and I wasn't asked about it before it happened. I was asked if I'd give a sample to be tested, and I did. As did all the nursing and other staff.
In terms of patients then being told their the test results, Professor Lee had moved on at that stage. Her understanding was that was something done by Dr. Goldman and Ms. Reva Miller. Do you know what the arrangements were for patients to be told that they had tested positive for HTLV3?
Yes, I did know that Eleanor and Reva were going to do that in the context of their sort of family approach to counselling.
Do you know whether patients were called in for special appointments or whether it was just something that was shared with them at the next scheduled appointment?
I don't actually know which it was. I would think they were pretty much called in, starting with the positives.
And do you know whether any advance information was given to patients or whether they effectively just turned up and not knowing that they'd been tested were told by Dr. Goldman that they were HTLV3 positive? I
don't know that, but I should think there's a few people around who do remember it pretty well. Well, a lot of people.
In terms of the staff who were present, I meant to ask you this earlier, Professor Tuddenham, the staff who were working at the centre by then, we know that Dr. Goldman was, and obviously Reva Miller, the latter being deceased. Dr. Kernoff, what other doctors were working in day-to-day clinical work at the centre in 1984-85?
We'd have had rotating trainees, what we then called senior registrars and registrars who were trainee haematologists. Permanent staff, permanent medical staff, other than myself, Dr. Kernoff, Dr. Lee, Dr. Goldman. No, I don't remember there were any others.
Okay. And then if we could have, please, BART 40675. This is a meeting of the Haemophilia Working Party of the North East Thames Region Association of Haematologists, 22nd of May 1985. You're not in attendance at this meeting, Dr. Kernoff is. Could I just ask you to look at the second page, please? It's the top of the page, where it said this: concern was expressed about the confidentiality of personal details of HTLV3 AB positive patients. No lists are circulated. And then it says this: all patients will be informed of the result of their HTLV3 antibody test on request and counselled on the implications of a positive result to themselves and their families. Now, that would suggest that as at May 1985, there are patients who've not been given their result and that they're to request the result in order to get it. Do you know anything about that?
No. That would be other centres than the Royal Free.
Okay.
Since, as we've said, I think all the patients at the Royal Free were informed.
Can I then ask you a little bit about what you say in your statement about research and some of the ethical principles regarding research? Can we have Professor Tuddenham's statement back on the screen, please, Henry? It is WITN 3435002. And if we go to paragraph 93, I'll give you the page reference in a moment, can you? Page 48. You say this in paragraph 93 at the top of the page. The first ethical principle of research involving humans is the one we inherit from Hippocrates, first do no harm. The second principle is that consent to take part in research must be a voluntary choice of the participant after a full explanation of the risks. These and other principles are well described in the Helsinki Declaration of 1964. And then you say this: it took several decades for a full implementation of these principles to be instituted through a formal network of ethics committees and establishment of local research departments tasked with monitoring the clinical research undertaken in host institutions. And you observed that at the beginning of your career in medical research, no formal procedures had been established to demonstrate informed consent or ethical approval. Why did it take several decades for those principles that you rightly identified being set out in 1964 to filter through and be implemented in the United Kingdom?
Yeah, I've looked at the history of this, including the documents you kindly sent me. As a medical student, I was very impressed by a book produced by Dr. Papworth titled Human Guinea Pigs, which was blowing the whistle on the kind of research and the low standards of ethics going on at the Hammersmith Hospital and at the Royal Free Hospital. Those were the examples he gave. It certainly got my attention. There was up to that point a kind of old boys and old girls network idea that doctors were all rather paternalistically able to decide what was best for their patients, and that they would follow the Hippocratic oath, and they wouldn't carry out research on patients that didn't meet the standards implied in that and in the general contract between doctors and their patients, so the doctors know what's best and the patients trust their doctors. And to a very considerable extent that did work, but it didn't really begin to take hold and to be formally instituted by the setting up of research ethics committees in local hospitals until the National Institute of Health in the US said that they weren't going to fund clinical research that didn't meet fully ethical standards as monitored by local committees. And then in the UK, a note was taken of that, and the Royal College of Physicians and the Department of Health began to work towards the establishment of those local research ethics committees. But it wasn't sort of fully and widely adopted and constituted in that form until the sort of 1970s. So, yeah, there was a delay, and these things do take a while to evolve, and now, of course, we have a very elaborate and well managed and fully applied standards for clinical research. But it was just kind of developed in a rather ad hoc kind of way, as I've mentioned. Sort of expressing principles in an international declaration doesn't immediately translate into activity on the ground, and one could wish that it had taken place more quickly. But so there was a kind of a period when it was not even clear that it was necessary to undergo ethical approval for a trial of a new drug, which seems surprising now, but that was thinking at the time, that if the doctor had spoken to the patient and the patient had just agreed to undergo the trial, there was no need for anything to be formally recorded.
And you've given in your statement a long list of some of the research projects you were involved with. I'm not going to ask you about the specifics of any of them, but you talk in some of them, particularly the earlier ones, about proceeding upon the basis of a concept of informed consent. Implied consent.
Yes.
What was the way in which that was approached by yourself and others at the time?
Okay, so there's only two clinical trial projects involving administration of new drug byproduct agents. One was the trial of the high-8C porcine factor 8 polyelectrolyte purified. The report on that doesn't even contain any reference to ethical approval. We did discuss with the patients what the new product was. It had undergone testing for efficacy and safety in preclinical studies in animals, and we just discussed it with the patients, told them why we wanted to give it to them, and if they agreed, we went ahead. That was the standard of the time. The other one was where I treated 4 patients, 3 with severe haemophilia A and 1 with severe von Willebrand disease, with the human factor 8 prepared with polyelectrolyte that Dr. Lane had made at Elstree. And again, we just explained to the patients why we wanted to do it. And they had the infusion. It was made, it was high purity, very high purity. It was made from UK voluntary donor plasma, so I would say it was low risk. They were all patients who'd had multiple infusions of multiple donor concentrates. And again, we just explained why we wanted to do it and discussed it, and they had the infusions and we reported it. And it was the first formal proof that von Willebrand factor supports factor 8 in the circulation. But it was the only time that that type of concentrate was used, and it didn't become part of the way that factor 8 was purified at Elstree. But as I say, those are the only 2 clinical research trials involving factor concentrate I was involved with at the Royal Free during my first period there.
The practice of building up a bank of stored samples that we know took place at the Royal Free, was that Dr. Kernoff's idea?
Yes, it was his idea, and it was innovative, forward-looking, and proved to be a resource for a very important research studies.
Do you know what, if anything, was said to patients about that, or about the purposes for which any samples would be stored and used?
No. I mean, Peter told me straight off from the start why he was doing it.
Which was? That
it was to track the potential effects of transmissible agents given to our patients, because he also stored a sample bottle from every batch of concentrate that we used.
Did you ever use those stored samples for any of your research?
On a couple of occasions, we were contacted by patients or their relatives, and I'm talking about the later period of my time at the Royal Free from 2006 onwards, wanted to know if we could get the sample back out and check when they seroconverted for hepatitis C and or HIV. And we'd get requests from time to time. They were useful usually in cases of litigation. So those are the only occasions on which I did use those samples. I don't know if you're coming to it, but there was a question of using them in relation to the most recent threat that's been identified in the blood supply, which is from prion disease, variant CJD.
I was going to ask you about that this afternoon, so absolutely we can come to it now. Professor Lee referred to it yesterday, and we looked at a newspaper report. You've dealt with the position in your statement in more detail, so could you perhaps explain to us your involvement in that issue?
Yes, when it became apparent that at least one patient with haemophilia had been found post-mortem, he died of other complications of haemophilia, that prion agent was detectable in tissue. Certainly, we realised there was a theoretical, more than theoretical risk of blood transmission of the protein agent that causes CJD and which caused spongiform encephalopathy in the UK cattle herd, to which the whole population was then subjected, and with some fortunately low level of transmission. When we, as I say, became aware that blood products could transmit prion agent, the haemophilia community took this very seriously, and we started looking over all of our patients who'd received a blood product from an individual who later developed new variant CJD. And it turned out that the largest group of our patients who had received such product were in fact patients with factor 11 deficiency, of which we have the largest number of patients in the UK because of the prevalence in the Ashkenazi Jewish population and our location in North London. And so we then had to advise those patients that they were considered at risk for new variant CJD. By the way, the entire population of UK is so considered at risk, and our plasma is not used for plasma product preparation if we were eating beef in the relevant period. But there was great interest in and concern about the extent to which haemophilia, our patients may have been exposed to these prion agents from UK bloods products, UK-sourced blood products. It's not considered that blood products made in other countries were also so at risk. So the stored plasma bank was of interest, and I was thinking of things to do with it, just in general terms, being a research-oriented clinician. And I got talking to the people at the prion disease unit here in London and asked them if they thought this bank could be of use in their researches. Now, at that point, there was no established test on plasma to find prion. The only tests we had then are to look in tissue and stain for the material that accumulates, the prion protein. And but there was a hope that such a test could be developed to look in blood. And the conversation had got just about that far when one of the researchers from the prion disease unit was at an international meeting and mentioned that there was a source of stored samples which would be of interest to look at. And so very prematurely, from my point of view, this became public. I hadn't got to the point of any arrangements, much less talking to our patients, which of course would be essential to do before starting under, by now we're talking 2010, I think, we certainly would not proceed to do any tests on that material without consulting with the people from whom it was taken. So I acknowledge that there was an unfortunate leakage of early stage discussions at that point and apologise for any concern or worry that may have caused.
And just whilst we're on the subject of VCJD, I wanted to ask you to look at a letter you wrote. It's HCDO 40835_001. It's a letter from you and from the clinical haemophilia nurse specialist at the Royal Free in December of 2006, addressed to Dr. Hill and to Dr. Hay in their capacity as UK HCDO, variant CJD and cost of endoscopes. Won't go through the entirety of it, but we can see from the first sentence, you say it's an ongoing problem for us. We have several patients whose treatment has been considerably influenced by the fact that they're on the at-risk register because they had concentrate during the relevant period. And then you go on to give details of the first patient, and picking it up about 5 lines in the bottom of that paragraph, our gastroenterologists were very reluctant to proceed with an endoscopic approach. Although they claim this was not because of the inevitable fact that the instrument would be quarantined, we don't doubt that it entered the decision. He's under consideration for a double balloon push endoscopy at St Mark's, but the instrument costs £25,000 and one would have to be bought for him. So that was a case of an individual whose treatment was effectively being deferred, or there was a risk it might not take place at all because of the cost of having to buy an endoscopy specifically for his surgery.
Yes.
And then the second patient you gave an example of, and this was a factor 11 case, not received one of the batches that contained a contribution from a VCJD patient, but nevertheless on the at-risk register. And you're saying you may have to purchase a colonoscope for that purpose. You've assured the patient and that the Department of Health has stated no patient's health will suffer. But there was going to be delay rather than something that could have been done in one procedure. And if we go over the page, in the second paragraph, you say these are only 2 out of a large number of patients potentially affected by the decision of the health protection.
What's on the screen isn't the second page at the moment. That is. Thank you.
Yeah. These are only 2 out of a large number of patients potentially affected by the decision of the Health Protection Agency, and this is a problem that's going to increase steadily as the large number of patients affected age and increasingly require various kinds of instrumental intervention for diagnostic or therapeutic purposes. You were raising this concern, and indeed it's been raised by a number of individuals in their evidence to the inquiry. How, if at all, has it or was it resolved during the time that you were at the Royal Free from 2006 to 2011?
Not definitively. We did our best for each patient in each circumstance, found a way round if we couldn't find anyone to use an endoscope. Eventually endoscopes were purchased, and there's a large store of such endoscopes, each one assigned to one patient that we have at the Royal Free for our patients. I think time only will eventually resolve this. Happily, the transmissibility appears to be pretty low with blood product for prion agent spongiform encephalopathy. We haven't had any more cases that I'm aware of. But it's an example of how you never know what's going to turn up next in blood as new agents appear.
And then, so I was going to turn to another topic. Would you like to take the break now?
Yes, that might be a good idea. How long do you think you need?
Well, I've got a few more questions for Professor Tuddenham of my own, not a huge number, but there needs to be sufficient time for recognised legal representatives to suggest any further questions to me that they want. I'm going to suggest 40 minutes, perhaps.
That sounds fine. So quarter to 4.